upload It'll later be uploaded to our Highline Library YouTube, and you can also find it at a Highline Reads library guide that I'll post a link for down below. So, um, like I said, thanks for coming to the Highline Reads program. It's a guest reader program with rotating readers on different topics for the adult set. Before we get started, we'd like to share a quick land acknowledgement. We'd like to recognize the people whose land that we are on today. Highline College itself, and where many of us live and work, resides on the ancestral native lands of the Duwamish Nation. And depending on our exact cities in this region, many of us live and work on the Muckleshoot, Duwamish, and Puyallup Indigenous lands. We honor the land and give gratitude to the First Nations people that are here. Thank you all. So without further ado, I'll introduce our reader for today, Ethnic and Gender Studies Professor Diego Luna. Diego will be exploring the theme of We Didn't Cross the Border Crossed Us. And he'll be reading the 2018 book by Ed Morales called Latinx, The New Force in American Politics and Culture. It was published by Verso. All right, Diego, the floor is yours for the next half hour, and then we'll be opening up the floor for comments and discussion, and we'll also be ending the recording then so that we can get as candid as we'd like. For the next 30 minutes, we ask that you keep your comments to the chat box until we can stop recording and talk candidly together. All right, welcome, Diego.
Hey folks, thanks to all the amazing folks at our Highline College Levy for having me. I didn't realize I was the first one this quarter, so my anxiety went up like tenfold, but that's all good. I'll power through, and it's good to see folks, see pictures. Yeah, I'm the third. Yeah, so I'm going to be doing a little, basically reading the intro of Latinx, The New Force in American Politics and Culture by Puerto Rican journalist, activist, writer Ed Morales. And just to give some context to the term that we threw into the intro, we didn't cross the border crossed us. This is paraphrased into English like a dicho or a saying that's pretty common in a lot of Chicano indigenous communities, particularly in the present day states of New Mexico, California, and in South Texas. And what it speaks to is the fact that when we, and the text is going to talk a lot about like Latino identity and kind of give us a little bit of historical insight to the different terms that we all use and see used. But this quote speaks to the reality that when, particularly when Mexico, after losing the U.S.-Mexico War in 1848, was essentially split in half. All right. The splitting occurred what's now at the present-day U.S.-Mexico border. And in that splitting, close to 500,000 people of Mexican and indigenous Mexican descent, indigenous North American descent, were left on the other side of the line, left north of the line, right? And many of these people did choose to go back to Mexico, but many stayed. And they were essentially what became the first Mexican Americans or Chicanos, right? And so ever since then, you've had this sense that not only were there people who were literally a part of the Mexican state and a part of all the different indigenous communities that comprise the Mexican state to this day, right? Currently, there are 58 official languages in the nation of Mexico, and 53 of them are indigenous languages. All right. In order to be to give some context, in order to be an official language in the Mexican state, you have to have at least 1 million speakers. So. And Mexico is by no means the most indigenous Latin American nation. Bolivia is like 75% indigenous people. Certainly for the folks who were left behind, so to speak, but then also for the many ways of migrations of Latinos who have come up to this land since then. For a lot of folks, right, that border, it's not necessarily arbitrary, but it's a border that was imposed on them, and a border that, when we look at the long swath of human history in the Western Hemisphere, that border hasn't even got to its teen years yet, right? It's still an infant, yeah, and that there were, for hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years prior to that border being imposed, there were many nations, language groups, peoples, tribes, who interact with one another and live lives entirely separate from the colonization that was imposed on them starting in the late 1400s, right? And most of these people are still here, right? Still practicing their languages, still surviving, trying to thrive, right? I mean, and that's one of the reasons why doing the land acknowledgement, it's not just some PR thing. It's to really acknowledge that the land that we're all on, regardless of our relationships to indigeneity, whether we are indigenous, whether we are descendants of settlers, whether we just came here, you know, a couple months ago, we all indebted to that legacy. And in different ways, as Basiks are all our different positionalities, we all are either complicit or actively engaged in that, right? So in other words, this is all our history, right? It's all our history. And so again, you know, to bring it back to that phrase, like we didn't cross the border crossed us, right? And, you know, to speak to kind of how the power of erasure, both historical erasure and historical omission, is it took me a minute to find a map that actually showed this. I don't know, can folks see this, the image that I threw up? Okay, hold on a sec, let me just do it again just to make sure. Okay, so it's really hard to find an image of what's now North America, which includes Mexico, right? Often people think Mexico is part of South America, and it isn't. Actually, Central America is also geographically considered part of North America, so they got left in the cold here. But it's really hard to find a map that doesn't have the imposed like colonial nations on top of it, right? And this is the beauty that's been recently published. You can go get this and purchase it, right? But you know, I wanted to put that up there just to give us a visual of this land that we all live on, that we all rely upon for our daily sustenance, for our lives. All our cultures, wherever they came from, are, you know, are cultivated, maintained on this land. That again, that we're really all kind of standing literally on top of the shoulders of the people that have always been here since time immemorial. And you know, I won't gild too much in that. I'll get into the book, but I did want to give us a visual, right, to think about. So let me stop sharing this. So I'm going to read essentially the first 12 or so pages of this text. And the author, he himself is Puerto Rican. And the main goal of this is he wants to complicate a lot of the ways in which, particularly in the United States, these different populations of these affects, these survivors, these resistors of colonization have been racialized. And he's not just talking about indigenous people, right? As you're going to see, he's also very powerfully talking about the African diaspora, people whose ancestors were brought here and changed, starting in the 1500s with the Spanish, the Portuguese, and later on with the English and the French in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. And so he's bringing all in these people to complicate how all of us are taught to understand not only this terminology like Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, but also how this terminology is a bulwark for these larger processes of colonization that we all are still invested in, whether we recognize that, whether it's something that we have to think about or want to think about every day, or something that it will go over our heads until explicitly brought right in front of us, right? So I'll just get started. And and he writes in the first person, so just give a heads up. So after several years of debate about America's progress on its racial question, the election of Donald Trump has brought white supremacy into the mainstream. Replacing coded dog whistles with an authoritarian bullhorn, he has openly declared undocumented Mexican and Central American immigrants to be violent threats to the American people and, indirectly, to the integrity of American identity. While Trumpian white supremacy still features anti-Black racism at its core, as well as a large dose of Islamophobia, its intensified scapegoating of the undocumented has disrupted the Black-white binary that has anchored race discourse throughout American history. And I should say, when he's using the term American, he's speaking specifically the United States, though all of us in this hemisphere are American. This continent was named by Spanish colonizers after an Italian Americano Vespucci, who actually never even came close to the US. He landed in what's now the nation of Brazil. But anyway, when he says American, he's speaking to the United States, right? Latinx, neither just black or white, and eternally considered outsider, despite our 500-year presence in this hemisphere, are poised to signal a crucial turn in this debate. Conversations about race in the United States have always been plagued by the unresolved trauma of Europe's colonization of the Americas and the resulting legacy of slavery. The United States, along with most of the Western world, has long roiled in an identity crisis stemming from the unfinished business of race and the slow decentering of the white male Western subject. Could America's identity begin to include people of color, women, and LGBTQ people? And I added the Q, and that wasn't there for the author. With the election of President Barack Obama in 2008, two contradictory narratives emerged. One of a post-racial society in which racism was withering away with the emergence of elites of color, and the other arguing that white supremacy and overt racism had been obscured by what sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls racialized social systems. The latter narrative pointed to a structural racism evident in racist microaggressions and in dog whistle politics, a set of coded signals transmitted to America's eroding white majority, assuring them that they were still in charge. Trump's emergence signaled the crash and burn of post-racial ideology, while at the same time foregrounding new racial scapegoats and blurring the neat boundaries of black-white opposition. Latinx is a book about a growing group of Americans who are injecting a different idea about race into the American race debate. It will attempt to demonstrate that Anglo and Latin America are two versions of the idea of America, with two very different articulations about race. In Anglo America, race is considered through a binary in which white and black are strictly defined opposites. In Latin America, while the racial binary still resonates, it is complicated by a tangled caste system that openly acknowledges several categories of mixed race people and different ideas about how to assimilate them. I don't intend to argue for the superiority of one of these ideologies or forms of social organization. They're both seriously flawed and represent competing traditions of Western modernism. But I believe that the Latinx view of race, inherited from nation-building ideologies that lionize race mixing in Latin America, poses narratives that challenge and resist Anglo-American paradigms. While these ideologies have not ended racism and in some ways have even reinforced it in Latin America, they have the potential to explode binary contradictions. The convergence of Anglo and Latin American ideas about race may point the way towards more nuanced ideologies and possibly significant social change. In titling this book Latinx, I'm attempting, like most of the young folks that are embracing this label, to engage with several threads of thinking about identity and naming, recognizing and evaluating the potential of such a label's elasticity and ability to evade categorization. I'm drawing attention to the Latinx people as one of the primary destabilizers of American, and by extension, Western identity. Often erased from America's founding narrative, Latinx, in all our previous guises, have always been present as a crucial counter narrative, a people that live in a world of many worlds, possessing an identity of multiple identities. So what's in a name? The advent of the term Latinx is the most recent iteration of a naming debate grounded in the politics of race and ethnicity. For several decades, the term Latino was a progressive choice over Hispanic. According to Cristina Mora's Making Hispanics, the latter was pressed into service by the Nixon administration in the 1970s, an apolitical attempt at an antidote to the unrest created by the increased activism in Latinx communities inspired by the African American Civil Rights Movement. As Nixon did with African Americans, he promoted Hispanic entrepreneurship by appointing a Mexican American as the head of the Small Business Administration. Hispanic became a pan-ethnic category whose development was fostered by data researchers such as the Census Bureau, political entrepreneurs of both liberal and conservative stripes, and media marketers, who ultimately created the vast Spanish language media. Hispanic overtly identified Latinx with Spanish cultural, racial, and ethnic origins. Yet Latino carried with it the notion that Latin American migrants in the United States were not merely hyphenated Europeans, but products of the mixed race societies and cultures south of the border who freely acknowledged that they were not white. It has been over the years become more widely accepted among liberals, while Hispanic still carries a strong weight among conservatives, including many who are Latinx. Still, as Latino became the preferred choice of those who wanted to identify as multiracial, gender politics quickly emerged in the politics of labeling. Spanish is a Romance language in which all nouns are assigned to gendered identity. Ordinary objects such as shoes, automobiles, and computers, for example, are male or female. Therefore, the Latino population necessarily consists of Latinos, male, and Latinas, female, and many other folks that fall well outside the gender binary, and that's my addition. As racial identity began intersecting with gender and sexual preference, Latino became Latino, Latina, and then Latina, Latino, with many different like strikes in between the A and the O to move an O out of the privileged position. After the universalization of digital communication, it briefly became Latino with the A asterisk among Latina and Latino student unions and nonprofit organizations, and in academic circles and books. For all Latinx's space-age quirkiness, the term has a technocratic emptiness to it that can make it hard to warm up to. It feels like a mathematician's null set, and many are unsure of how to pronounce it. And even amid ongoing debate around the term on campuses and in the media, the growing movement to embrace Latinx highlights how it dispenses with the problem of prioritizing male or female by negating the binary. The real power of the term and its true meaning, however, erupts with this final syllable. After years of Latin lovers, Latin looks, Latin music, and Latin America, the word describes something that is not as much Latin, a word originally coined by the French to brand non-English and Dutch-speaking colonies with a different flavor, as it is an alternative America, the unexpected X factor in America's race debate. So who or what are Latinx, and what is the nature of our doing? Latinx intends to describe the in-between space in which Latinx live, which allows us to cross racial boundaries more easily and construct identities or self-images that include a wide variety of racial, national, and even gender-based identifications. Rather than simply creating a new shade of person somewhere between white and black, this in-between space has the potential to reveal the blackness and indigeneity often erased in Latin America by race-mixed utopian ideologies, but kept alive through oscillating tendencies towards tolerance and repression. Many pre-modern roots and traditions remained intact, while others, fragmented by Spanish colonialism, always threatened to reemerge, and new hybrid identities like the syncretic religions of Afro-Caribbean took hold. While race-mixed culture in Latin America evolved with the help of Catholic doctrine, Spanish law, and 20th century nation-building ideologies, the development of racial identity in the United States has been significantly different. Because of the United States' unique racial ideology of hypodescent, one drop of black blood makes you black, with no official recognition of the mixedness in stated ideology, media, or common sense discourse, the hybrid and mestizaje elements of American culture remain obscured. Yet the widespread creation in the United States of hybrid and hyphenated identities such as New Yorican, Chicano, Dominican, North, Tejano, and Miami Cuban has created space for excluded identities to assert themselves. For Latinx in the United States, this relatively new process of creating hybrid identities dates back to the end of the Mexican-American War and the absorption of the South of territories in 1848. While the hegemony of the black-white racial barony has effectively rendered a true understanding of the Latinx experience unintelligible in the standard narrative of American history, the pattern of racial discrimination has had the paradoxical effect of encouraging a stronger assertion of African and indigenous identities. This became particularly clear in the 1970s when Puerto Ricans in New York formed the Young Lords, a militant political group modeled on the Black Panthers, and Chicanos of California and the Southwest organized around an indigenous identity connected to the imaginary homeland called Eslan. In a nation built on profit extracted from slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, the exploitation of imported Asian workers, and guest worker bracero arrangements with migrant Mexican labor, Latinx can play a pivotal role in uncovering the uncomfortable truths of America's dark past, as well as the fallacy of non-racist societies prevalent in the countries from which our parents immigrated. While the one-drop rule was metaphorically rehearsed in Latin America, allowing a majority to believe that we were white, this whiteness has not transferred smoothly to the States, revealing not only US racism, but also aspects of racial identity formation that have been papered over in the home countries. And for all of us who are part of the Latino diaspora, many examples are coming to our minds, right? When our families come to US and suddenly our race changes or how we're racialized shifts, in many cases dramatically. The messy conversion conversation about racial identity, multiracial identification, passing, and potential interethnic alliances has already begun. Yet the possibility looms of a shift in the United States towards what have been called the triracial system of whites, blacks, and an unnamed in-between category, presumably of those of mixed race or not quite white identities, in which, as Eduardo Bonilla Silva argues, Increases numbers of non-Euro-American people will be increasing numbers of non-European people will be granted honorary white status. One of the challenges observing the Trump era will be to monitor how the extension of class privileges to non-whites that began in neoliberal Obama world may actually continue, despite the seemingly overt white supremacist rhetoric embodied by Trump. The fact that as many as 29% of Latinx voted for Trump indicates that these privileges may be extended to people of color who accept the language of xenophobia and intolerance as a path to the restoration of American greatness, quote unquote. What is race for Latinx? There is a long and unresolved argument about what race is, what racism is, and when and where it started. Historians have traced anti-Black racism to antiquity, although it has not always been used to justify slavery. Regardless of when and how the idea of race began, it seems to be the product of a distrust and/or condemnation based on distance, whether in religious beliefs, physical location, or phenotypical appearance. Some historians and religious scholars believe that the biblical story of Ham, the son of Noah banished to reign over Africa because he laughed at his father's nakedness, was revived in the 19th century and sparked the ill-conceived race science that defined 5 racial categories. Foucault, on the other hand, argued that racist thinking emerged from the civil wars of the medieval era among the nobility and was merely translated in the formation of the European state. And the decolonial school, particularly followers of Argentinian Mexican philosopher Enrique Dussel, proposed that the Spanish Catholic reconquest of Iberia after almost 800 years of gradually rescinding Islamic occupation transformed religious differences into ones based on race. As the 20th century unfolds in America, we are still grappling with racial division, which the election of Trump appears to have made even more explicit. Trumpian authoritarianism shuns difference and promotes intolerance to protect white supremacy and make America great again. But despite Latinx being racialized or branded as non-white, it's not clear how they fit into the new authoritarianism. Through centuries of racial mixing, Latinx in some senses constitutes our own race, all but one that includes Northern, Southern, Eastern, Western, and Mediterranean Europeans, Northern and Sub-Saharan Africans, Muslims and Jews, Semites from the Middle East, Asians from East Asia, and their descendants called Native Americans. The word that is often used to denote the Latinx, our collective race, itself a mixture of races, is raza, Spanish for race. This use of raza became popular in the early 20th century to describe mixed race society in Mexico, largely driven by the publication of an essay by post-revolutionary Mexican Minister of Culture, Jose Vasconcelos, titled La Raza Cósmica, or the Cosmic Race. The essay argued that Latin America's mixed societies geared a kind of racial transcendence that would end racial categorization and liberate humanity. Long story short, that didn't happen in Mexico or anywhere else in Latin America. Vasconcelos' treatise formalized a social process of race mixing called mestizaje, a system of racial ranking based on permutations of sexual unions, sometimes coerced, sometimes allowed by the relaxing of laws against intermarriage, between Spaniards, indigenous people, members of the African diaspora, and Asian migrants. Vasconcelos' Raza Cósmica, which grew into an ideology that had parallel versions in several Latin American countries, was the 20th century reimagining of a centuries-old, inherently racist caste system through which a particular and somewhat tainted brand of Spanish whiteness devalued, diminished, and erased the presence and importance of indigenous Americans and those of African descent. Membership in La Raza was ostensibly open to everyone, but was ultimately a mechanism for gradual whitening over generations. African indigenous presence in politics, culture, and sports was embraced, but only to the extent that it prioritized universalized national identities and minimized cultural particularities. As Latinx became a part of the fabric of Anglo-America through both the absorption of the Southwest territories in the mid-19th century and gradual migration from the Caribbean and South America in the early 20th, Raza became part of the local vocabularies. While not entirely universal among Latinx, some prefer Hispano, others Latino, Raza began to primarily be used in the United States by Mexican immigrants. Faced with racism in their new country, they used the term to unite different Latin American national identities into one progressive force and collective brown identity, one that would give voice to marginalized people of color erased by mestizaje. There's an irony here that can only be explained by viewing the migration of Latinx to the United States as a kind of dialectical process, in which one view about race collides with another and creates something new. The same mestizaje ideology that worked to subliminate indigenous and African identity in Latin America became a resource for Latinx to claim racial difference as their identity in the black-white racial binary of the United States. This is central to the Latinx factor and explains why Raza matters in America. It also explains why the choice by the National Council of La Raza to change their name in 2007 to Unidos US, fearing that Latinx would be marginalized by the Trump version of white supremacy, was a panicky attempt to blunt the racial awareness of the term of the label Raza. Though Raza has been primarily used by Mexican Americans, who make up about 62% of all US Latinx, other Latinx groups have drawn on variations of the term to identify themselves, particularly when confronted by the binary choice of black or white. The word at once carries a legacy of the Spanish idea of race and how it was transferred to the New World, but it has a kind of pliancy that makes it recognizable concept among Latinx. And the author used it here to mainly make the structure inherent fiction of America's race narrative visible. Time check, where are we at? Cool. All right, I think that I'll leave it there because to go into the next section would be like another 15 minutes, and I want to give us some time to process and chat. And apologies, I know I was consciously trying not to read fast, but that's kind of how I do, so.
All right. Thank you for reading, Diego, and thank you for everyone who's still here and who tuned in. At this part, we'll end the recording.